Hello and welcome to another episode of the Spotlight Sessions. My name's Ilan Fisher. I'm the host. I head up our nonprofit partnerships at accessiBe, and today I'm super excited to be having a conversation with Professor Peter Novak. How's it going, Peter?
I'm doing pretty well, Alan. Good to see you. Thanks.
Good to see you too. We were speaking about this offline a second ago, but your CV is absolutely phenomenal from the media training, communications, your work is kind of a vice president in the university and also being such an important voice on student issues as well. But you've really, what kind of brought us to this conversation today is you've been doing a lot of work in the inclusivity space. So I'd love to know a little bit about you, about your history, background, and kind of where you got into this world.
Sure, absolutely. I grew up in a small town in Michigan called Flint, which is known for its bad water and how the city sort of poisoned, thousands of people through lead contamination. That's what it's known for now. But when I was growing up, my father was the eye doctor for the Michigan School for the Deaf. He was an optometrist. And so I grew up constantly around both deaf and blind people, and sometimes deaf blind people. And I had a curiosity and started learning sign language from a friend of mine who I went to school with. And so I grew up speaking sign language both because of my family. My oldest sister was deaf in her left ear. She never went completely deaf, but it prompted my parents to learn sign language. And so it's always been an interest. And then when I started going to theater school and did my MFA in acting and my master's in English Lit, I started thinking, gee, what would it be like to actually translate Shakespeare into American Sign Language? Because there haven't been really translations of it before. And so that's what I started to embark on, was try to investigate. And it's funny because most people really don't know a lot about American Sign Language. It is not the same as English, right? A lot of people think that it's just a form of English on the hands, and it's not. You can do so many different, it's a completely different language. And so it's different from British Sign Language, for example,
Yeah.
right? British Sign Language and American Sign Language, completely different. ASL uses the alphabet on one hand. British does it on two hands. A, E, I, O, U, very different than American Sign Language. Israeli Sign Language is different. Mexican Sign Language is different. So it's interesting to know that these types of, that ASL and English are so different. And so most people don't realize that, and I talk about it's also a performative language. It's on the body, so it's really like reading the body as a text, which is fascinating too. Everything in front of the body is in the future, everything behind the body is in the past. That means the body's always in the present moment, which is really cool. It's like the sign for tomorrow goes like this, you right there. The sign for yesterday goes backwards, and the sign for recently scratches the cheek just in front of the past. I mean, just, recently.
That's cool.
And it is really cool. And you have to inflect, you have to show emotionality and things like that, because if I just sign to you with no expression on my face, the expressions are part of the language. For some words, you actually have to puff out your cheeks or stick your tongue out and raise your eyebrows to show that it's a question. And the other thing about it is that it's the word order is different. And so if I say, are you going to the meeting in Chicago next week? I could say it in something called signed exact English, which would look like this. Are you going to the meeting in Chicago next week? But in American Sign Language, I would put time first, and I would say next week, meeting Chicago, you go, right?
Okay.
And what I do is I put Chicago, over in this space, and all I have to do is point to it, and that means Chicago, and it's really cool. And if I would say, no, I hate Chicago, I would just turn and go like that. That's the sign for hate, right? And
Like this?
like this, yeah, just flicking it like that. And if I turn it towards Chicago, it means I hate Chicago, right? So you can set up this architectural space that's amazing. And so for my the big project, I worked for 2 years with a team of deaf actors, performers, dramaturgs. It was a whole team. About, I would say, 15 people worked on it in total over 2 years. and we had to videotape the translation. And if we made a mistake in it earlier, or we had to go back and re-videotape it, because you can't write sign language down. That's the other thing. It's a
How many
four-dimensional
takes do you think you
language.
guys took?
Oh my God, I don't even know. Thousands. We recorded it, and then we did a full-scale professional production of it as well in Philadelphia. And we filmed that one, but it's really interesting because the Actors Union, Actors Equity Association, wouldn't let us videotape it. um, and so I did videotape it because it was the only real translation we had of all the changes that we made. And I needed to have that document, that artifact, otherwise it would have been lost to time. And they were going to fine me, and so I had to raise the money to pay Actors Equity Association to pay all the actors to be able to release the video. So it was really interesting issues around accessibility and disability, because Equity did not consider the translation to be on videotape to be a translation. They viewed it as a performance. And I was viewing it as a translation, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So anyway, it was pretty interesting. But there are lots of problems with translating Shakespeare too. I could go into some of that if you if you want.
So I'm really interested in kind of your foundation and organization. What is their mission when it comes to translating for accessibility purposes? Is it like, yeah, just talk me through kind of
Yeah,
what that
so
looks like.
well, the work is the ASL Shakespeare Project overall, and it is geared toward making Shakespeare more accessible. And so we have the full-scale translation of one of Shakespeare's plays called Twelfth Night. But the amount of work it takes into going into, translating one play, it took years, dozens of people, lots of technology. One of the ideas out of Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. is to crowdsource. And there was a team of faculty there who said, oh, let's crowdsource Shakespeare, which I think is a great idea.
It's a great name
Ethan's,
as well.
isn't that great? Crowdsource Shakespeare. And so, get people now who are deaf around the country and put text up online and have them submit their translations and do a crowdsourced translation. It could be a really cool way to, translate more of Shakespeare's works. The other cool thing is that we found recently a production from 1988 that had, and the script we thought was lost, but through the miracle of, social media, somebody said, I think I've got the script in my garage. I was like, go look, because in the script was written in a form, it's really hard to write down sign language. You can't write it down, except there's a form called Stokey notation. It's a linguist's way of writing sign language. And they use some of that for their translation. And so you can go back and read it and kind of piece it together. But what I'd love to do is interview all the deaf actors who are in it and talk about what they did. And we hired one of those actors in our production of Twelfth Night. So it's a really interesting dynamic to work with both sets of people who were in translated productions of Twelfth Night, which is rare.
That's so awesome. And one of the things that I've been curious to really ask you is, when you were working with your team of 15 deaf and blind actors, what were some of your preconceived notions coming into it, and how did your kind of views, because I have to imagine they only changed throughout working together or throughout the production. So tell me a little bit about kind of that journey you've been going on.
Yeah, it was probably the most frustrating and the most rewarding professional thing I've ever done, probably. It was really challenging. And so I can give you I can't probably talk about some of these. I guess we're not on cable, but Shakespeare is, has dirty language. He has things that are physically very, very dirty. And so in sign language, all of a sudden you began to see some of these things. And I'll give you an example. There's a servant whose name is Malvolio. And this young girl disguised as a boy comes in and says he wants to speak with his boss. And the boss says, no, I'm busy. I can't do it. Tell me, what does this boy look like? And so Malvolio describes the boy and says, he's not young enough for a man, not old enough for a man, nor young enough for a boy, as a peas cod when 'tis almost an apple. And so we translated that as he's like fruit that hasn't matured yet, right?
Okay. I understand now.
Right. And all of this other language that really was pretty graphic, and so the deaf audience was laughing, really a lot, while the hearing audience was like, what? Why are they laughing about fruits and vegetables? And so, he even talked about as a squash is before it, matures and gets bigger. So all of this very phallic visual language. And so I think the hardest part for me was trying to translate idioms based in hearing into a visual idiom, right? Because all the characters in the play were also deaf. It's not like the characters were playing hearing characters. Everybody on stage was playing a deaf character and speaking in sign language. And so, if you translate Caliban's lines from The Tempest about this isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not, how do you translate it into something visual? And so maybe it's the trees moving in the wind, and you show it visually. And the best thing I learned from one of the deaf actors was show, don't tell, right? Show me, don't tell me, don't describe it, but show how it works. And that's what sign language can do more than anything else. And by far the best thing was a deaf poet named Peter Cook. He's really well known, and he helped us translate the songs and the music in Twelfth Night. It's the most musical of Shakespeare's plays. And I was like, oh great, why did I choose this play to translate? But he tells this story about death and unrequited love. It's like, and he does it in a way where he shows, death looking up at him, and he says, come on, death, and it shows death marching toward him. These are called classifiers. You can use one hand shape to mean many things. And so death comes, and death looks down at him, and he plays this character, death, looking down and then looking up and seeing him taking his soul and throwing it down a dark tunnel. You can see his legs, going down and then he shows his head going like this, right, as he's falling down the tunnel, and he keeps cutting back and forth between these images. And then his body lands, and he shows his body land like that, and then death begins to shroud him in cloth for burial, and you see him being shrouded like this. It's an amazing performance. It's one of the most visually stunning performances. And when I show it to hearing people after I've talked about deafness and ASL and deafness as a culture rather than as a disability, then everybody sort of ends the talk by saying, oh my gosh, I totally get it now. I understand that ASL and deafness is really a different language and a different culture based on that language. And it's really not as much about disability. And that ASL is so much more poetic in really interesting ways than English can be. And that's the goal of what we're trying to do, right? Expand both accessibility to works that haven't been translated, and to really expand the creative uses of ASL too. It's really fun.
I love that, and I like your take of it, because to me it seems like when you speak about deafness as a cultural phenomenon rather than disability, it makes me think a little bit about what I think of accessibility. Accessibility can also mean understanding, in the terms of when you describe deafness, or that experience of deafness through that way, through ASL, it's just only giving me a deeper understanding, and therefore going to increase accessibility, because now I'm going to think of this not as, what some people might think of as a challenge or as a barrier, but just another facet, which is really, right, Peter, what I love to ask everybody who comes on the show is what accessibility means to them, because everyone's got their own personal professional experiences that shape how they think about accessibility, or how accessibility touches them. So I'd be super interested to hear kind of what accessibility means to you, because you've got a very interesting perspective, and the perspective that probably only I don't know how many people have, you know.
Yeah, so I liken it to when you're thinking about designing something or creating something new, creating it for the widest audience possible, right? It's for making it, designing it and building it so that everybody, no matter who they are, and that's what I love about accessiBe, is it's got so many different ways. It's such a
Hmm.
smart technology. But really, the sort of universal design principles.
Yeah.
And I love universal design because it's so important. It's to think about from the beginning, right? From the beginning of your project or your website or your ideas and things like that, making it as accessible, as open, and designing it from the beginning for the widest range of people possible. Um, and that's really an interesting topic. How do you do that in performances? How do you do that on the web? How do you do that with written text? How you even provide closed captioning, right? So, for example, when I do videos in closed caption, I like to show the entire sentence at this while as it's being spoken, but have one word light up as it's being spoken to show the
That's
rhythm of the
interesting.
language. That's better for non-native English speakers, actually. It helps them learn and follow the rhythm of the language and actually learn it much more quickly than traditional subtitles, right? So there's lots of really good brain science about all of this too that we can start to integrate into really good accessibility for everybody.
That's super interesting because when you said the ones of kind of like jumping up, that makes me think of like when I was a kid and you're
Mhm.
watching television, and that's the
Mhm.
way subtitles were for me. But right now you have like the closed captioning Netflix effect, in which you'll have like
Right,
let's say almost the whole sentence before it's actually spoken, and
right.
then I use, for example, Descript, which is a
Hmm.
really awesome tech company, and they will kind of automatically upload everything, and then I can kind of change it and even add words or delete
Yep,
words.
yep.
So
I
that's really
use
interesting.
I use Otter.ai for meetings with international teams that I'm coaching because it transcribes what I'm saying as I'm saying it,
Hmm.
which is amazing, right? To do live transcription, it's like having your own coder right there, and it's also geared towards people with different accents. So it has been trained on Chinese accents, Indian accents of English, all of these different accents. And so it is more accessible for a wide range of people. It's an amazing technology that uses AI. So yeah,
That's
so much
phenomenal.
going on, right? With text and everything else that's happening. It's pretty cool.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier is when we're speaking about universal design, I always like the idea of really building out your user journeys, thinking, okay,
Mm,
if I'm a user who's in crisis, how would I interact with this? If I'm a user who's happy, how would I interact with it? And I
mm,
think, you know, that can really elevate the world of accessibility. Is if you think of it of like,
mhm,
um, if you think of it as like how can you map out that user journey, think of it as a product manager, as a
mhm,
designer. You know,
mhm.
there's so many so many cool spaces and technologies and design
Mm.
principles that we can learn from that I think can really only elevate the profession of accessibility. And I think also, you know, the work that you're doing with ASL Shakespeare for sure is one of those things that's elevating the
Thanks.
work of accessibility. So
Yeah,
really
thanks.
my last question
Mm,
that I have,
mhm,
Peter, is if you had a message to, let's say, the business community or business owners, specifically
mhm.
considering that you work very much in the technology world and in San Francisco where a lot is happening, I'd love to hear kind of how would be the best way to, you know, integrate the deaf community or just integrate, you know, more inclusivity initiatives at large.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the reasons why we also made the website was, and the website is completely bilingual. So we had essays about Shakespeare that we had translated and used deaf faculty from Gallaudet University. In fact, she was the dean of arts and sciences who would translate these essays into American Sign Language. And I think that's the biggest thing for deaf people is recognizing that when they're reading in English, they're actually reading in their second language, right?
Hmm.
That their primary language is a completely different language. And so when they're reading in English, they're reading in a second language. And so it's like, how do we make things more accessible for people whose first language isn't English? for example. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking. And pretty soon there's going to be technology that's going to translate from, from what you're speaking into almost every language. Sign language is going to be a little bit more complicated to do that with because of its visual gestural modality. So if I were a business owner, I would say, first of all, for small business owners, accessiBe is it's just an amazing technology. So we're using it on the ASL Shakespeare site. We're using it on my consulting site because accessibility is crucial, and making sure that you're creating a business that is open and diverse, and that really integrates the newest technology to make sure that you are accessible. It's a win-win for everybody.
We appreciate that. And Peter, I just wanted obviously
Yeah, good
appreciate it.
plug for it. I mean, when I saw it, I was like, oh yes, finally, a technology that can do what you need it to be done, right? And in a way that I think is really smart and uses AI to really go through and make sure your pages are doing what they need to do and communicating what they need to. So I'm thrilled with accessiBe.
We appreciate the plug.
You bet.
And Peter, just in closing, I just want to thank you so much for giving your time. I know you're super busy, but the work that you're doing at ASL Shakespeare is awesome, phenomenal. I've learned a ton, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will too. And I look forward to our next collaboration, our next conversation. Have an awesome rest of the day.
Thanks, you too. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.